say I'm perfect already? What's the temperature like? Warm? It's probably good. Brent will be happy, won't he? Do what? Yes. All right, everybody, let's get started this morning. Let's ask the Lord to bless our time before we get started. Lord, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for these people. Lord, thank you that we're united in your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, I pray that you would send your Spirit to help us this morning, that you would bless our time, that we would see your Son in the Old Testament. Lord, that we would know him more, love him more, and worship him more for what he has done for us. Lord, please guide our time now. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. We're continuing our study of the Messiah in the Old Testament. Specifically, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at types of Christ. We've talked about that several times. Just a quick review. A type is a person, place, thing, an object that points to an antitype or a fulfillment that's yet to come, right? We talked about that a couple times, but quick reminder. So a type is something that points to a later fulfillment that will be greater than the type. Last week in Genesis and Exodus, we looked at Isaac as a type of Christ. We looked at Jacob's ladder. We looked at Joseph as a type of Christ. We jumped into Exodus and looked at Moses. Then we looked at the Passover lamb, the Red Sea, the Israelites being led through the Red Sea, and the manna in the wilderness. That's what we've covered so far. And as I've said before, this isn't an exhaustive list of all the types that are found in the Old Testament. There are many more. That's not our intent or purpose. We could literally be in this type of study for a very long time. So we're just trying to do a survey and highlight some of them. We're going to jump back into Exodus 17. If you want to follow along, we'll be reading some, spending more time on some of these types than others. But we'll be in Exodus 17 for just a few minutes. Now, Israel is in the wilderness. This is right after, really, when God provides manna in the wilderness for them, which is Exodus 16. Now, Exodus 17, they're in the wilderness, and they grumble and complain because they need water, the Israelites do. And they do need it because they're in the wilderness. They need water to survive. And Exodus 17, 1 through 7 says this: Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff, which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? It's a famous incident where Moses provides water for the people. And this actually happens again, I think it's in Numbers chapter 20, if I'm not mistaken. So it happens again later on in the story of Israel wandering around. But this is the first time. Notice what it says in verse 6. Behold, this is God speaking, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it that the people may drink. And then Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. It's interesting because the Lord, this is Yahweh, says he will stand on the rock, and then Moses is to strike the rock, and then water will flow out of it. So Yahweh says, I will stand on the rock, which is interesting. Interesting that he says that. And the water obviously is life for the Israelites. I mean, it's literally life, right? They're traveling. They're in this wilderness. They need water to survive. Just like they need bread, they need food to live. They also need water. It's really interesting because in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul references this story in Exodus 17. In 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 8, it says this, For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea, right? Remember that? We just talked about that last week. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now, these things happened as examples. By the way, that word is the same word, tupos, that we get type from right there when it says these things happened as an example or as types for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as is written, that people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. But again, notice, I hope you did not miss this, but in verse 3, they all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. It's a really interesting passage, and I kind of wanted to just hit the highlight where it says Jesus is the rock and kind of move on. But it is a little confusing, and hopefully I'm going to spend just a few minutes here and try to unpack this story, so hopefully it makes a little more sense. Paul is using the Israelites in the wilderness as an example for the Corinthian church. He literally says there, it's written as an example, as a type, for us, so that we would not crave the evil things that they did. And remember, the Corinthian church, they had a problem. They had a sin problem, right? Paul writes to them and rebukes them. They had a major sin problem. And Paul seems to want to make sure that the Corinthian church does not assume that because they have been baptized and because they partake of the Lord's table, that they can sin and do whatever they want, that they can live how they want to. Even though they've been baptized, remember 1 Corinthians chapter 3, they're bragging and arguing. Paul addresses, some are saying they were baptized by Peter, some by Cephas, and they seem to want to put this status on baptism. They're bragging about it, boasting about it. So Paul's warning them, just because you have been baptized and you're partaking of the Lord's table, do not think that you can sin and do whatever you want. He goes back and references this story that Israel was baptized through the Red Sea and led by Moses, all of Israel. And they all partook of the same spiritual food and drink. So in other words, God provided for all of them. But God was not pleased with most of them, and they were judged in the wilderness. What's that judgment in the wilderness we're talking about? Well, 23,000 fell and they disobeyed God, but also that faithless generation winds up wandering in the wilderness until they die out. So God's judgment is on them, even though he delivered them through the Red Sea, and even though he provided manna and water for them. Pastor and Professor James Hamilton has some lengthy comments on the passage that I think, again, are just helpful for us to understand what Paul is talking about in Corinthians. He's actually written a very large, dense book on typology. I'm not going to pretend like I've read the whole thing. I have not. But he's got some good stuff and aligns with us really well theologically. Anyway, he makes some comments. When Paul speaks in 1 Corinthians 10, 3 through 4 of the Exodus generation eating spiritual food and drinking spiritual drink, he clearly has in view the manna from heaven and water from the rock. He seems to refer to these as spiritual as opposed to natural. Paul uses that same language, natural, in 1 Corinthians 2:14. A natural man does not understand the things of God. He seems to use this language, spiritual as opposed to natural, because unlike normal food and water obtained in the usual human way, this food and water were provided through the direct intervention of God. So when it says spiritual food and spiritual drink, it seems to be what he's communicating. This is something that's delivered in this divine, supernatural way. And that's why he references it that way, as spiritual food. Paul goes on to identify the rock as Christ in 1 Corinthians 10:4. Hamilton goes on to say that this spiritual rock, for the same reason the food and drink was spiritual, it is a spiritual rock for the same reason the food and drink were spiritual, because it is not a naturally occurring physical stone as a source of water. It's a spiritual rock. What does that mean? That God is doing something supernatural there. Water does not typically come from a rock. I don't know if you've ever seen that in your lives out there. I have not. But we know that's not normal for water to come out of a rock. It's not actually occurring physical stone as a source of water, but something that results from the direct intervention of the transforming work of God. Second, just as Moses identifies Yahweh with the rock, and he's referencing Deuteronomy 32:4, where Moses connects Yahweh, he calls Yahweh the rock. He calls Yahweh the rock. And there's other places in the Old Testament where God, Yahweh, is identified as the rock. And just as John identifies the Christ with Yahweh, we know that explicitly in John's gospel, John is making the case Jesus is Yahweh, right? All the I am statements, a lot of what is in there is to say that Jesus is Yahweh. So just as Moses identifies Yahweh with the rock, and just as John identifies the Christ with Yahweh, so Paul identifies the rock with Christ. Just as the point of identifying Yahweh as the rock was to communicate his presence with, protection of, and provision for his people, so also Paul asserts that the people of Israel experienced the presence, protection, and provision made by Christ. Not just Yahweh, but Christ. This affirms the inseparable operation of the members of the Godhead. What the Father does, the Son does, and it matches Jude, this is an interesting reference, it matches Jude referring to Jesus, the Lord, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt. I know it's a long reference. One more, hopefully again to help us understand what Paul is saying here. Paul's point here is to warn the Corinthians. He urges them not to think wrongly that they can sin with impunity, or sin thinking they're free from punishment, since they partake of the Lord's Supper. His proof against this is that even though the Israelites partook of the type of the Lord's Supper, he's saying that the manna in the wilderness, the type of the Lord's Supper, God judged them for their sin. So God sends manna, they experience it, the spiritual food, the supernatural deliverance given to them, but they're still judged. Why does Paul assert the rock was Christ? By doing so, he affirms that the God who saved Israel at the Exodus and in the wilderness is the Christ who has saved Christians. Again, Paul making this explicit reference to the rock as Jesus Christ. That this rock in the wilderness that gave them water is a type of Christ. It points to Christ, and that Christ was actually providing and delivering to the people there because Jesus is Yahweh. Hopefully that's not too confusing. John also makes a reference in John 7:37. Jesus says this in John's gospel. Now on the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." This reference that we know points us again to that language of the rock being struck and water flowing out. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Just as water from the rock was provided by supernatural means, again, Water does not come from rocks normally. So Jesus is provided by divine intervention through the Virgin Mary. You see that correlation between the two. And just as the rock in the wilderness was struck, Moses strikes the rock with his staff, so too Jesus is struck at the cross, right? Wounded at the cross, killed, crucified at the cross. And just as the struck rock provided water that nourished and gave life to the Israelites, that's what it did, right? This water literally gave them life, kept them from perishing. So too, when Jesus is struck at the cross, his death nourishes and gives us life. Jesus is the true and better rock. Paul makes that connection again in 1 Corinthians 10:4. So all that background, hopefully to understand, because it's a little bit of a confusing passage when you're reading it, but Paul's just making this example of what the Israelites did, and he's saying that Christ is the rock. He provided for them because he is Yahweh, and also that they shouldn't sin and not expect judgment. Anyway, all that to say, Jesus is the true and better rock. Second half of Exodus 17 is about the raised hands of Moses in Exodus 17, 8 through 16. So again, right after this story of the rock. And Amalek, or the Amalekites, Israel's enemy, one of their arch enemies, comes out and makes war on them during their journey. We'll pick up in verse 8 of Exodus 17. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself at the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. Then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and named it "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." Now, I'll admit, I think this type is a little bit less well known, and we do have to think a little bit with it. But get this picture. So the Israelites are going to do battle, right? Amalek's come to make war against them. And Moses says the way that they're going to be delivered is by holding up his staff, right? This is the way that God is going to deliver them, by Moses stretching out his hands and holding up his staff. So Moses and Aaron and Hur go up to the top of a hill. So they're overlooking. But they go up the mount to a hill, or on top of a hill. And Moses stretches out his hands with the staff in them. And the text says in verse 11, so it came about when Moses held his hand up, meaning his hands, the staff, that Israel prevailed. And when he let his hands down, Amalek prevailed. So they're victorious as long as Moses is holding this staff up. Verse 12, but Moses' hands were heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, right? So he gets tired from having to hold his hands up during this battle. It's not done in 30 seconds, right? This is an ongoing battle, and he has to hold his arms up, and he gets tired, so they support his arms. Now, again, we have to think about this one a little bit, but think about that, just the correlation. There's got to be a correlation for a type. We've talked about that. Something that connects the type and the antitype. There's got to be some kind of escalation in it. So the antitype, the fulfillment of the type has to be greater. There's got to be some kind of redemptive significance going on with the type in order for it to be so. Just as Moses goes up the mount to bring victory to the Israelites, Jesus Christ goes up the mount to Golgotha in the same way. He goes up the mount to Golgotha to give his people victory. And just as Moses outstretched arms with the staff, the idea is he's holding his arms up with an outstretched arm. Just as Moses does that, and it causes Israel to prevail over their enemies, so too Jesus on the cross, with outstretched arms on the cross, gives victory for his people over sin and Satan. Moses' work here leads the people to victory, and so too Jesus is victorious by his death, burial, and resurrection. And that type, this victory that's given by Moses in this way that he does it, points us to Jesus on the cross, going up to the mount, arms outstretched, gaining victory for his people. It's again another example of Moses as a type of Christ and what he does. The next one is the tabernacle in Exodus 25. The tabernacle. I think the women are going through a study on this. Is that right? I think they're going through a book. That's a really thick book. So don't expect to get that kind of detail because we're doing a quick survey, okay? But the tabernacle is a major type of Jesus. If you go to Exodus 25, 8 through 9, there's a couple verses that highlight this. Exodus 25, 8 through 9, God says, "Let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell among them according to all that I am going to show you as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furniture, just so you shall construct it." In verse 8. Verse 8. "Let them construct a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." It's a key phrase to think of as you're reading those couple of verses. That I may dwell among them. Exodus 40 expands on this a little bit. In Exodus 40, verse 1, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. You shall place the ark of the testimony there, and you shall screen the ark with the veil." We'll talk about the ark in just a few minutes, but the ark of the covenant is in the tabernacle, and it's covered by the veil. Verse 34 of Exodus 40. "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day when it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night in the sight of all the house of Israel." So literally, when they get the tabernacle complete, God comes, and this cloud comes over the tabernacle. It says it fills the tabernacle with the Lord's glory. This is the idea of God coming and dwelling with his people. That's what the tabernacle is about. God coming and dwelling, living with his people. That's what's pictured here. Now, this type points us forward. It points us forward, but it also makes us remember back to the garden. This type makes us remember back to the garden. Because God dwelled with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Remember that literally when after Adam and Eve had sinned, it said that the Lord was walking in the cool of the garden. So he's with them. He dwells with them. And that's the idea, even before, obviously, we get that picture in Genesis after their sin. God dwells with them in the garden. But what happens? They sin and they are exiled from the garden. They're exiled from the garden, and two cherubim keep them from entering back into the garden, into the presence of God. So they're separated from it. They're cut off. Jumping back to the tabernacle is this picture of God. And obviously this picture comes up in other times because God is delivering Israel. But the tabernacle is a picture of God coming and pursuing sinners. Because God comes to dwell in and with the camp of Israel. And yes, there are all these rules and regulations and laws for sacrifice, and he puts the sacrificial system in place so that they will be ceremonially, ritually pure. But it's a picture of God coming and dwelling with sinners. And it's not because Israel is so great and mighty. As a matter of fact, we know at the point of the tabernacle being built how how much they complained and disobeyed and rebelled against God. So it's not because they are so great and wonderful, but it reflects God's graciousness and his compassion for sinners. Again, the tabernacle, God coming and dwelling with man, with Israel, that points us to the true tabernacle, Jesus Christ, right? It points us to the true tabernacle, Jesus Christ. John 1:14, as many of you know, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten Father, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." And as many of you know this as well, that word dwelt in our passage and dwelt among us is literally tabernacled. It could be translated tabernacled. Jesus came and tabernacled among us. That's specific language that John is using. He's specifically referencing that. He's saying Jesus is the true tabernacle. Jesus is Yahweh. who has come to dwell with man. He, Jesus, came to pursue sinners and die on the cross to restore what's lost in the garden, the fellowship with God, the communion with God. Jesus comes and does that. Jesus is the true and greater tabernacle. When we read about it, it points us to Christ who's going to come and dwell with man. A lot more that could be said about that. Go to the women's study if you're a woman. Read the book. I'm sure a lot more detail on that. What's the name of the book? God in Our Midst? God in Our Midst. Anyway, the next type related to the tabernacle is the Ark of the Covenant. That's in Exodus 25, 10 through 22, and I'm going to read this passage. We may not think about this either, but the Ark of the Covenant is a type of Jesus. The Ark of the Covenant is a type of Jesus. Exodus 25, 10 says this, "They shall construct an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, and 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and out you shall overlay it, and you shall make a gold molding around it. You shall cast 4 gold rings for it, and fasten them on its 4 feet, and 2 rings shall be on one side of it, and 2 rings on the other side. You shall make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, they shall not be removed from it. You shall put into the ark the testimony which I shall give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold, make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim of one piece with the mercy seat at its 2 ends. The cherubim shall have their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings and facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I will give to you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in commandment for the sons of Israel." The ark is basically a box, right? But it's a very special box. It's a box, very special box, overlaid with gold. It's ornate, and it has these 2 cherubim on it. We'll talk about those in a second. And it's placed in the tabernacle. And if you know, in the tabernacle, there's the outer courtyard, and there's the inner Holy of Holies. I may be missing another spot in there, but there's the Holy of Holies, right? And the Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant resided. And there's a veil that separates it. And not just anyone was allowed to enter in there. God resided on the ark. He resided, his presence was on the ark. It was holy. And we see just how holy it was from an example in 2 Samuel. If you remember this story, what happens? In 2 Samuel 6, the ark is being transported. It has these rings on it for them to put poles through so they don't have to touch it. They're transporting it, and it starts to, fall, and Uzzah reaches out to steady it and touches it, and God strikes him down. Strikes him down. The ark is holy. It is set apart. God's very presence resides on it. Inside the ark are the testimonies of the Lord to Israel, the law. There's a jar of manna, and then later there's Aaron's rod that budded, or his budding rod. On top of the ark, as I said, there's 2 cherubim that are facing each other. This is the mercy seat. The mercy seat is the lid, so to speak, that is on top of the ark. And there are these 2 cherubim that are facing each other. Now, what are cherubim? Cherubim are angelic beings that are typically associated with guarding the glory of God. They're mentioned in Genesis 3:24. I just mentioned them a minute ago when I said that Adam and Eve were exiled. What's guarding them from coming back into the Garden of Eden? It's 2 cherubim, specifically. Not just 2 angels, but 2 cherubim carrying the flaming sword. They keep Adam and Eve out. In Exodus, we see this reference here over the ark. And then in Ezekiel, there are multiple places describing the cherubim. We're not going to look at those, and they're also likely referenced in Revelation 4. So they're mentioned in several places in the Scriptures. So what is the mercy seat? This lid that covers the ark with these 2 cherubim facing each other. Verse 17 of our passage. What passage are we in? Exodus 25, yes. Verse 17 of Exodus 25, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold, make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Verse 21, you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony which I will give to you. There I will meet with you. And from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, which are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you about all that I will give you in commandment for the sons of Israel. It's interesting because the Hebrew word for mercy seat, is related to the Hebrew word for atonement. Atonement. What was done on the mercy seat? Well, you have to skip ahead to Leviticus to see what the priests did with the mercy seat. But what was done on the mercy seat? Remember, again, this is in the Holy of Holies, behind the veil. The high priest enters once a year on the Day of Atonement. We'll get to that probably next week, but enters in once a year. And what does he do? He offers the sacrifice of the bull and the goat. And what does he do with the blood? He sprinkles the blood 7 times on the mercy seat. He sprinkles the blood of these sacrifices on the mercy seat. That is what happens. This is how Israel, the high priest comes to make atonement on the Day of Atonement for the people of Israel. That's very significant. This is fascinating to me too, as I was studying this, because I did not realize this, that the ark was such an explicit type of Christ, pointing to Christ, but also these other connections. It's fascinating. What is the Septuagint? You can stay with me here. What is the Septuagint? The Greek translation of the Old Testament. And you're like, where are we going with this? Just hang on. The Greek translation of the Old Testament that was widely used by the Jews after it was translated. It was translated around 300, 200 BC. BC before Christ, right? Before Christ comes on the scene. While the Jews are actually in exile, coming back from exile, right? So they've been dispersed from Israel, and they're brought back. And this was done because the Jews were exiled, and they were increasingly Hellenized as a part of the Greek culture around them, to the point that many of them did not actually speak Hebrew anymore. They actually did not speak Hebrew anymore. There was a need for a copy of the scriptures in the Greek language, the language that most of them spoke. So the Septuagint is the Old Testament in Greek. What's interesting is what Greek word is used for the mercy seat in Exodus 17 and other places. What's interesting is the Greek word that's used. It's the word I can't even say it. Hilasterion. I'm not even going to look at Traver. Hilasterion. It's used 2 times in the New Testament. This word from the Greek, the Old Testament in Greek, right? The New Testament authors are writing the New Testament in Greek primarily. They use this same word, or this word that's used for the mercy seat in Exodus. It's used twice in the New Testament, in Romans 3:25 and in Hebrews 9:5. Now, what does this Greek word mean? This Greek word carries the idea to propitiate, related to atonement. To propitiate, which makes sense because they're translating that term from the Old Testament. It carries the idea to propitiate, which means to appease or turn away the wrath of God. Turn away wrath by sacrifice. What does Romans 3:25 say? Jesus, speaking of Jesus, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation, hilasterion, that Greek word, in his blood. Uses the same word. Hebrews 9:5, and above it, this is speaking of the mercy seat, and above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Hilasterion, the same Greek word. The mercy seat of the ark is where propitiation was made for the people of Israel. The high priest enters in and he offers this sacrifice and he sprinkles the blood on top of the mercy seat. The mercy seat, literally, the word meaning atonement, or the Greek translation, propitiate, to turn away the wrath of God. That is where the wrath of God is turned away. right then, at that time, on the Day of Atonement, as the blood is sprinkled on it. And Paul connects Jesus to the mercy seat by using this term in Romans 3:25. Jesus is our propitiation. Jesus Christ is our mercy seat. Jesus Christ, in his body, in his sacrifice on the cross, he turns away and appeases the wrath of God by offering up his life to suffer for us, for sinners. And because his blood is shed, because he dies in our place, God's wrath is turned away. It's redirected from us. It's not that it just vaporized and it disappears. It's poured out on Christ. But the result of that is his wrath that is directed at us is no longer directed at us. It's turned away because Christ has taken it. And what's the result of that? The result of that is that God and man are reconciled. They're reconciled. That was the point of the mercy seat in the Old Testament. The mercy seat is the place where God and Israel are reconciled. Israel has sinned against God. The sacrifice is made, and now they're reconciled because of that. God's wrath is turned away. Jesus literally does this, not figuratively. He literally does this for us. The mercy seat turns away God's wrath, but Christ actually does it in a real way, not just ritually, not just ceremonially, but he actually turns away the wrath of God. One more quick point on this. John makes a really interesting reference as well in his gospel in John 20, as we think about Christ is a propitiation at the mercy seat. It's really an extraordinary reference in John 20, 11 through 12. And obviously, John did not direct the angels how many there would be or where they should be sitting. God did that. But what does it say in verse 11 that John records for us? This is after Christ has been crucified. Christ has been laid in the tomb. Mary has come and looked, and she says that they're gone. The body is gone, so she goes back, and she tells Peter and John, and they run, and they come see that his body is gone, trying to figure out what is going on. In verse 11, but Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping after Peter and John have come and looked, and they're like, the body is not there. And so as she went, she stooped and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. These angels at each end of where Christ's body, they testify something. They testify that Jesus made propitiation. Just like the mercy seat with the two cherubim on each end, propitiation is made right there. They're testifying that Jesus is our propitiation. He has turned away the wrath of God. Atonement has been made. Jesus Christ is the true and greater mercy seat. He is the true and greater mercy seat where atonement is actually made. Fascinating to ponder on the typology in the Ark of the Covenant. It points us to Christ. When we read about the Ark, when you remember the mercy seat, think about Jesus and what he actually does, what it pictures for you. Last one, really quickly, the priesthood in Exodus 40, 12 through 15. The priesthood is a type of Jesus. The priesthood is a type of Jesus. What did the priest do? The priest went between God and the people. They offered up the sacrifice. We know there was the high priest. That's another type of Christ. But the priesthood, this office, they function as a go-between between the people and God. And they offer up the sacrifices to God. They're mediators. They go between. We also know that they're imperfect. And Hebrews tells us one of the big reasons they're imperfect, or there's two reasons, but one of the reasons they're imperfect is because they die. They die, so there has to be this continual stream of priests coming in to minister in the tabernacle. They also had sin, so they had to offer sacrifices for themselves first before they offered sacrifice to the people. Two quick references. Hebrews 7:23. The former priests, on the other hand, existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Author of Hebrews making this correlation between the priest in the Old Covenant and Christ, and how Christ is better because he does not die. He has died. He's been raised to new life. He will never die again. He is superior to the priests in the Old Covenant. And it goes on to say, therefore he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And verse 29 of Hebrews chapter 9, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one. This is talking about the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, and where the ark is. But Christ into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Jesus is so much greater than the old covenant priest because of what he has done. He's the true and better priest who's offered himself up once and for all, and he holds his office forever. We do not have to worry that the priesthood will be abolished, that Israel will be conquered, and we will not have someone to make sacrifice for us. Christ always lives to intercede for us. All right, 10:45, we are done. What'd you say?
You said it right.
Do what?
You said it right.
You should have said that.